Hello, and welcome to the first episode of our series Reasons for Our Faith. And the purpose for this series is to basically equip us with reasons for why we believe in what we believe in. I believe it's important for us to understand why we hold onto what we hold onto as believers, as Christians, especially Seventh day Adventist Christians. So, this series is basically going to walk us through various teachings and doctrines in the Seventh day Adventist faith and kind of explain why we believe these things to be true from the Bible. But in today's episode, I want us to begin somewhere rather philosophical before we actually land into the scripture, because I believe it's important that we establish these basic things before we can proceed to the rest of what we'll be talking about in this series. And today's topic is about truth. I think there's a lot of confusion in our day concerning this topic. What is truth? Is there such thing as objective truth? And this is what I want us to look at today. What is truth? So, truth is basically defined as a collection of propositions that are coherent and correspondent. Truth is a collection of propositions that are coherent and correspondent. Now, what does that mean? A proposition is a statement. Truth is a collection of statements that are coherent and correspondent. Now, there are two words that I've actually used here that are very important for understanding, and that's coherency and correspondency. So, what does it mean that truth is coherent and correspondent? That means that truth, when we talk about its coherency, truth is logically consistent. Coherence is something that actually is logically, if something is coherent, it means that something is logically consistent. It is, you can actually make sense out of this thing. Therefore, truth makes sense. It's logically consistent. Because the only way you actually define something as making sense is if it's logical. You can actually, you can rationally work through it. So, truth, by its very definition, makes sense. It's logically consistent. But when we talk about logic, most people have a misunderstanding about logic. When we talk about logic, logic in itself is not a belief system. But logic is rather a set of laws that govern human reasoning. So how we think is governed by the laws of logic. And how we work around problems, how we think through issues is governed by certain laws in how we think before we can actually get to a conclusion. You see a lot of this in the scientific world, in the mathematical world. So basically, that's what logic is. It governs how we think and how we go about exercising rationality. And one of the most important laws in logic is a law called the law of non-contradiction. And this law basically means or states that something cannot be true and not true at the same time, in the same sense and the same relation. That's like just a simplified definition or explanation of the law of non-contradiction. Something cannot be true at the same time, in the same sense, in the same relation. That means that two diametrically opposed statements cannot both be true at the same time. Either one is true and the other is false. They both can't be true at the same time. So a contradiction is something that actually does not make sense. And contradictions, by their very nature, are the hallmark of error. If you want to know whether or not something is wrong, one of the ways in which you just simply have to investigate it is to see whether it contradicts itself. If you want to know whether a certain statement is wrong or an idea is wrong, just look at how or whether or not it contradicts itself, because truth does not contradict. So that's I think one of the most important laws in logic, the law of non-contradiction. But how about correspondence? What does correspondence mean? So when we say truth is correspondent, we basically are talking about um, truth's its relation to reality. Um, Remember when we define truth, we said it's a collection of propositions. If that proposition is made, uh, that means it can be investigated and 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 observed in reality. And if we do observe that, if it is true, then we must see it correspond, align itself to what actually is, as we observe. So that is basically what correspondence is all about. Truth is correspondent. If I said um, something is white or the vehicle outside is white, if we went outside and checked it out, we must find that the vehicle is white, and we shouldn't find a different color of the vehicle. It should be white. And if we do observe that it is white, then what I have just said is true. So truth actually corresponds, it aligns itself with reality and what actually is. So it's coherent and it's correspondent. Now I want us to look at um, these two types of truth. Um, and these are subjective truth and objective truth. What is subjective truth and what is objective truth? Well, a simple way of defining that is this way. Subjective truth is truth that is dependent on the subject, and the subject in this case is the person making the truth claim. Um, so, in other words, it's opinion based. So if the subject, who is me in this case, makes a truth claim, and the validation of that truth claim is dependent on me, then that's subjective truth. Um, Subjective truth cannot be tested or verified. There's no method or way you can actually verify that truth. For example, if I say red is my favorite color, you cannot verify it by any scientific or established means to actually find out whether red is my favorite color. It's dependent on me. My opinion in this case is what actually matters. But when we get to objective truth, it's truth that is dependent on the object, regardless of the subject's opinion. So, me as the subject does not the truth or some whether or not that thing is true is not dependent on what I think as the subject. It's rather dependent on the object, and this in this case the object being the thing that I'm talking about. So going back to colors, for example, if I made the claim that red was actually promotes health, the color red promotes health. I may have an opinion on the issue, but it's not dependent on my opinion. It's dependent on the color and its relation to health. So we actually need to carry out some test to prove whether or not that is true. And that's another thing about objective truth. Objective truth can be verified or falsified, and that is one important characteristic of objective truth. It can actually be verified or falsified. So in this case, we can actually verify or falsify my claim. How do we do that? We just probably carry out a test and observe how people how people whether or not people's health has improved by looking at the color red, and whether or not it hasn't improved by looking at the color red, and we can all carry out those tests and see that. But that was just um, a, a small example on how you relate to these things. So objective truth is independent of opinion. It's dependent on the object, and it can actually be verified or falsified, and that is the when by established means and methods of investigation. And as opposed to subjective truth, which is completely dependent upon my opinion in this case on the subject. Now, how do we know truth? How do we um, uh, find truth, investigate truth? Well, when we go back to the definitions that we just gave at the beginning, um, from the definition, we can actually get three ways in which we can investigate truth, and that's its logical consistency, its empirical evidence or evidence, and its relevance, logical consistency. How consistent is this claim logically? Is it consistent? Does it have contradictions? All those things. Second thing is evidence. When we test that claim or put that claim to a test, can we actually observe um, it in reality and its relevance? I believe the truth is relevant, and this is why we actually look for it. So these are basically the ways in which we can investigate truth.